Welcome again to our Tuesday talk. We're delighted to see you. Many of you members, many of you not members, and I always remind those not members we'd be delighted to have you as members. Because we do depend on memberships and donations. We have no City of Branson funds in the museum at all. So it's totally private at this point. Also, we're always grateful. I'd like to express that gratitude to Barb and Joe Reich for allowing us, the Society and the museum, to use these facilities at no charge, which I think is very gracious of them. Our future programs are to be announced. We haven't quite settled on them, so keep watching for the emails and other notices of what's coming up in September, October, and November. Well, we have with us today a person who is an entertainer and an historian. So we believe now we're going to have an entertaining historian. He is also tends to run for re-election of Mayor of Garber. And if you can't figure that out, that's interesting. Anyway, John, we're delighted to have you with us once again, and we wait to hear from you. Thank you.
Thank you, Jim. Good to see you, everybody. And Jim asked the question a moment ago, if I'm running for mayor of Garber, just where is the campaign headquarters? It's in a real pitiful, brushy spot along the railroad tracks, 300 feet from the county line, with no highway access, and that's the way it'll always be. As Garber mayor, all I do is oversee ticks, chiggers, and snakes. So that's basically how that all goes. It's so good to be with all of you today, and part of the reason for this is actually the 100th anniversary of the passing of who would be known to all the fans as Old Matt and Aunt Mollie, but it's J.K. and Anna Ross. My grandfather, Willard Jones, my mama's daddy, hi Mom, Mom's here today, sitting back there in the nosebleed section. Mama's daddy was a wonderful Garber resident, born actually in Oklahoma, but by the time he was 2 years old, he was back in the Roark neighborhood on a farm that his dad had purchased 80 acres that he had got back in 1908, and that remained a part of their family property up until Grandpa's passing near the end of 2004. And my grandpa Willard was an individual that you really had to pay close attention to, especially when he got into talking history, because man, he had a saddlebag full of things, and I paid real close attention when I was around him. I kid you not. I took notes. I did recorded interviews with him, and this was all things that happened just in the years right before he passed. And anytime we would talk about, Garber-related topics, the man always preached about 4 individuals that, kept the Garber community on the map, and J.K. Ross here being probably the main one and being remembered as the patriarch of the Garber neighborhood, but there was 3 others, and that would have been Bob Campbell, Bill Fronebarger, and a fellow by the name of Newton Cox, and they all had long-time Garber connections. We could do actual individual talks on any of those fellows and be here for days. But anyway, I'm going to keep this limited. You're going to be proud of me, ladies and gentlemen. I have written notes, so I've got an actual little guideline to stay close to here today, so we won't be going off down rabbit trails and all that good stuff. So I'm going to do my best to kind of stick with all this and get through it. And I do want to allow a few moments for a question and answer segment. And believe you me, it's very easy to get me stumped, so that's a possibility today. So anyway, we'll get this all underway. My grandfather Willard reminded me a lot that even though Mr. Ross's name was John Keever Ross, that no one dare ever called him John. He preferred to be called by his initials of J.K. And some of you will remember Walker Powell, who was another one of our fine individuals. Walker said the exact same thing. You never called him You never called Mr. Ross by that name of John. It was always J.K. And there was even a time when Mr. Ross was writing for the one of the local newspapers, he got fed up with the mail and the people bugging him and addressing him as John. So he had the newspaper publisher actually spell it out, J-A-Y-K-A-Y, to get the point across that he is J.K. Ross. So I want to cover just a little bit of Mr. Ross's early life. Again, the reason for doing this because of the 100th anniversary of their passings. He died at age 71. The date was July 14th, 1923. His wonderful bride there, who was known as Aunt Mollie, Miss Hannah, had passed away 4 months prior to him, to the day. Her date was March 14th, and she died at their little house there at the Garber town site. And I'll show you guys a photo of that in our visit today. So the Ross family was out of Pennsylvania. J.K. Ross was born there in February of 1852, and he was the oldest of 7 children. His daddy was a full-time farmer, but also a building contractor. Everyone called his father by his initials as well, which was J.J. Ross. So J.J. was a wagon maker and a skilled carpenter. And young J.K. had this memory as a 10-year-old boy, and I've got these dates wrote down. He recalled when his father enlisted in the Army in Pennsylvania and ended up as a part of the Pennsylvania Volunteers and these Pennsylvania soldiers marching off to war. He said his dad enlisted on August 9th of 1862. He ended up being a corporal in Company H in the 134th Division of the Pennsylvania Volunteers. But J.K. said in his little autobiography, he said the one thing that he was most responsible for, being the oldest of 7 children, he had to do all the farm work with assistance from his mother. It was up every morning, milk the cows, take care of the duties, you know, then go to school, do your schoolwork, then come home in the afternoons and spend the evening repeating the process of those farm chores. So fortunately though, his dad returned home after just nearly a year of service, if not even a year actually. He was honorably discharged in May of 1863, and that was a result of an injury that gave him an honorable discharge. Now the family ends up leaving Pennsylvania and goes over to northwest Indiana, and this would be in the vicinity of what you would call Monticello, Indiana, and they relocated there and maintained that property from the late 1860s, 1867, going forward. I will clarify that J.K.'s mother died in Idaville, Indiana, and she's laid to rest in the Idaville, Indiana cemetery. His dad remarries a much younger lady. 50, get this, 50 years difference in age.
Wow.
Yeah. So, wow. Yeah. So they tie the knot and they end up relocating later to Yates Center, Kansas. And as I've dug through all the local newspaper columns through the years, just trying to find out a little bit more about his dad and this new wife, oh my gosh. They said one day J.J. Ross came to Garber by train, got off the train, and everyone mistook him as being the brother of the Garber postmaster. So they apparently looked a lot alike. My wife and I, Luana, we found the cemetery there in Yates Center, Kansas, where his dad and wife number 2 are laid to rest. And then lo and behold, last year at Shepherd of the Hills, the police chief of the Yates Center Police Department was on board my tour, and I said, we have a little connection here. And so that was kind of cool to get to point all of that out. By 1880, let me back up, I'm getting ahead of the story here. 1872, here we go. So J.K. Ross has decided as a 18, 19-year-old young man to leave the Indiana farm and branch out on his own, and he's got a young school teacher friend, a fellow that's just a few years older, and these 2 young men are just going to go explore wild country, as he puts it. And this wild country, they go all over the place, but they end up in Kansas. and they end up near a little community known as Burlington over here in Coffee County, Kansas. Well, what took place was JK's school teacher buddy apparently wasn't satisfied, turned around and went back to Indiana. Well, JK decides, okay, I'm going to make myself available as a farm hand, and this is where JK gets into the carpenter side of things, but he found work on a local fruit orchard there. And this is owned by the Howe family. Now there's two spellings of the Howes, and it's either going to be H-O-W or H-O-W-E. And so anyway, the Howe family running this orchard property, they've got 6 kids, and their second-born daughter falls in love with JK, and she's 2 years younger. She was born in 1854. Her name is Mary. They tie the knot, and this would have been in July of 1872. And so they are just fine with staying there in the Kansas neighborhood there at Burlington, and then 1874 hits, and some of you remember this in history class when y'all were kids, when they talked about the grasshopper plague that swept from North Dakota down through Texas. It wiped out every farm community in that part of the US of A. So what JK recalled was all these Kansas farmers and plantation owners all just packing up and leaving, and it was just so devastating with this grasshopper plague. He said, I really doubt that any of these folks and any of these families are ever going to come back to Kansas. So everyone's kind of on the go, everyone's on the move, and that entire summer going into the fall of 1874, it's basically a mass exodus. Well, Iowa didn't hardly get a hit at all off of this grasshopper plague. So JK and Mary end up in the Skunk River Valley, southeast Iowa, and they stay there through the entire winter, 1875 going forward, and then they got a letter from his dad, JJ, who's got a minor health problem, needing help on the farm. They end up going back to northwest Indiana, to Idaville. And this will be when Mary becomes pregnant, and their little baby boy, Charles Robert Ross, is born in January of 1876. So I tell everyone on my tours out there at Shepherd, understand that Aunt Mollie, Mrs. Ross, is actually a stepmother. She is the mother who raises that little boy, and we'll get into this here in just a second. You're dealing with stepmom here, and what ends up taking place, they end up staying in this neighborhood of northwest Indiana, and again, Mr. Ross staying very, very busy with building contractor work, and they end up going west to Newton County, Indiana, and it's there that they bump into this young lady that's working at a boarding house, and she's a Kentucky girl, and her name is Anna Willis. That's W-I-L-L-I-S. So that would be her real name, her maiden name. Now, I've looked through Ancestry, and guys, I'm stuck. I am stuck on this woman. I'm going to tell you, I cannot find anything prior to the 1880 census with this woman. When you look at those census records, it clearly shows who she's living with. She's working as a seamstress, clothing designer. She's a servant with this family by the last name of Burgess, and it kind of just, we're just kind of stuck there. No details on her background really at all. What has been a little bit helpful, friends, is the fact that J.K. Ross wrote a little paperback booklet in 1913, and this is a first edition copy of Old Matt's view of it. And he sold these, had them printed down here in Mountain Home, sold them at the Garver Train Depot for 25 cents a piece, because the visitors and all the fans after the Shepherd of the Hills that came out were constantly bugging him, just flooding him with questions. And he says, here, buy a book. Everything will be answered. So that's where that all morphed from. And this book gave just a few tidbits of details. It doesn't go in depth on our beloved Aunt Mollie as Mrs. Ross, but I will pull up a little piece here that I want to share with you. I should have brought bookmarks today, and I did not do a very good job of that. But anyway, what we've got on her here, I'll read this passage. This is out of my rough draft of the Garber Book Project. All right. So they're married in 1880. Here we are. What ends up happening is, let me find my spot here. All right, here we go. He's taking care of this little baby boy of his, Charles, all right? And he says in his autobiography, he says, "It was during this time that myself and the baby boy, who was kept by an old couple at whose home was the occasional stopping place of the father, this young woman happened in some way and took up her abode there and called it home, and interest in the baby boy was as much manifested as was that of the father." So here's their courtship, which leads to their marriage July 1st of 1880. They didn't stay in Newton County very long at all. Charles is growing up into being a fine young man and is into schooling. They discover through newspapers, it was being advertised about all this free government land in southwest Missouri. And so he drops what he's doing as a building contractor and comes out here on his own. He stops at West Plains first. Mr. Ross was just very briefly in West Plains, but discovered that the amount of work just wasn't quite enough to sustain a family. So he heard about this opportunity in Springfield, Missouri, because it was like the one of the hot spots for the Frisco Railroad and whatnot. So they end up coming there, and naturally, Anna and young Charles will join him there. This is where they bought a hotel property, turned it into a boarding house, and she's continuing her seamstress business as a clothing designer. It appears, from what I've been able to research, that as Charles is growing up, he's not too keen on this big city lifestyle of Springfield, and so he persuades his folks to consider relocating again. So here they go. They end up buying 40 acres 10 miles south of Springfield. I have not went through all of the Greene County records, nor have I went through Christian County records. I do not have any inkling of an idea where this little farm might have been. But in 1893, they turned around and sold it, and they found the perfect buyer. Some of you will recall the little bit of an economic slump that was happening in the U.S., where there was bank foreclosures and things. It was about a 6-month period there of 1893, and things got a little scary there for a while, but they did find a buyer for that 40-acre piece real quick. And so that's what leads them to Taney County. Now Charles is 18 years of age. He had been down here along the White River with some of his school friends for hunting and fishing, and was just in love with it all. And he commented to his folks, he says, "These Taney County people are living the quiet, simple life." So he's the one that basically persuaded his folks to make the move to the Taney County neighborhood. So here we go, all of this government land, and there's no claim office in Taney County in the 1890s. The claim office was in Springfield, where they were all based out of. So they make the 5-day horseback trip. It's just J.K. and Charles, and they come down and they meet up over here right on the Stone Taney County line at the Forks, and meet this gentleman named Levi Morrill, who is running a post office in the living room of his house. And that would have been the Notch Post Office in its very beginning stages. And so here they go. Levi tells them, let's saddle up and we'll ride up over the ridge here. There's some good land here really close. And so if you can picture this in your minds, a hot summer day, August of 1894, and Levi Morrill, J.K. Ross, and Charles are on horseback, and they come up on what would later be Inspiration Point for the very first time and see that view. And they're just right there swallowing all that in, right? Well, this is where they ride down the hillside. They're moving kind of in an easterly direction, and they see that beautiful view into Arkansas. They were just absolutely blown away with all of that. But the fact that right there where they were, as they're admiring this, there's a really refreshing breeze blowing, and that breeze still blows so wonderfully to this day. Well, that's when they made the decision, also based on the timber quantity. There was a big stand of white oak right there, just below the big mountain top. And they thought, you know, with the size of these oaks, this is going to be perfect for building a log home. So they tell Levi Morrill, hey, this is the 160 that we are interested in. Well, okay, boys, you got to turn your horses around and go back to Springfield and file out your claim with the government claim office, and it's yours. So here they go. 5 days later, that's all done. Now, I'm going to tell you, and you've heard others say this, it was very true that the government was way, way, way overwhelmed with all these new settlers coming to our region. Part of what it was all about was there was these wild rumors, even in the 1890s, that they were going to build a railroad somewhere through here. No one really knew where, but there had been various railroad organizations and various camps of surveyors coming through trying to find, okay, where can we put this railroad? So with that rumor out there, it made the neighborhood really, really inviting so that folks could capitalize off of that. They end up getting their claim all put in place. By the way, they're there on their future farm, and J.K. and Charles are off their horses, and they drove survey stakes into the ground to measure what would be the perimeters for the cabin. And they measured it out at 16 feet by 20. Anyway, back home, got all the government paperwork filled out, and they had no idea. By the way, here's a great photo of Charles in the lower left corner. Anyway, they got all that filled out, and the problem was, again, the government is way overwhelmed. They cannot file a homestead claim in a timely manner, and it was this way everywhere. It should have took a matter of a few years. Well, friends, it ended up taking 9 years before the Rosses received their deed in their hand, showing proof of ownership of this beautiful 160-acre farm. Now, yeah, they are right on the county line. When you're up there today where Inspiration Tower is, basically that is the county line. So the county line is the west property boundary for this 160 acres, and it's a perfectly squared 160-acre homestead, and almost all of those neighboring properties were in that shape. So anyway, they've got everything done in Springfield. Well, now it's fall 1894, and J.K. and Charles have got all their tools with them, and they're going to start construction on this so-called log house, right? And they end up having to find a place to stay. Well, their neighbor down on the top side of Mutton Hollow, directly below them to the south, Mr. Powell, has a place that he's going to be able to rent to them, and so that's where they set up camp and lived while this house is being constructed. And they went all the way into the winter of 1894, going forward into 1895, and finally had this house complete by that summer. And one of the sources that I have read states that there was a fourth individual that moves into the home with him. And I did some digging and discovered that that fourth individual was Mrs. Ross's sister, Nancy. Now, again, I'm at a roadblock on this woman, bless her heart, because I have not been able to find who Anna Ross's parents are, siblings, nothing. But J.K. Ross said in his little paperback booklet that she lost her mother when she was young, and she was raised by an uncle. And so there's a lot of confusion on just how all this comes down. And I did more research and did find out who the sister was, and the sister's family, they all end up in Tulsa at some point. But anyhow, beautiful home, beautiful view, and everyone admired Mr. Ross's craftsmanship abilities with this thing. He went so far to make sure that everything in the corners all interlocked, all of that hand carved. They saved all the shavings as they're hand hewing all this out, and they saved the shavings, and that's all mixed in there. When they chinked everything out, these shavings, these little slats are cut down anywhere from 4 and 5 inches in length. Some are nearly 2 feet in length, but that's all mounted in there, and that's what gave the home such great structural stability. In 1902, they add a bedroom on this west side along with a kitchen around on the opposite corner. So when this stranger from the big city, Harold Bell Wright, shows up and gets acquainted, and that was all kind of a big accident. Harold Bell Wright was simply just turned around and was trying to get down here to the river and could not cross the river because of flooding, and so he ends up getting acquainted with the Ross family. They allow him to spend the night, and boom, now we've got a major friendship. And Mr. Wright is told by the Rosses, hey buddy, you can come back here and camp anytime, because just It just so happened that Mr. Wright got a tour of their farm. They took him up on the big mountaintop up there behind the house, and there's this amazing view. And Harold Bell Wright says, "Wow, this is my new favorite place. This is my happy spot." So now here we are going forward, late 1890s, 1900, also the years 1902, 1903, 4, and 5. Harold Bell Wright is making repeated visits. Sometimes he might come for 2 or 3 days, other times he might be there for a week. He comes down in December of 1904 for his second visit in a year. He was pastoring the First Christian Church of Kansas City, Missouri, and brought some members of his congregation down for some squirrel hunting fun. And Harold Bell Wright says to the Rosses, "Hey, I'll see y'all next summer. I'm going to come back and I'm going to camp with you guys for several months if you guys are okay with that. I'm going to work on a brand new book about this area." And friends, that's where Harold Bell Wright left it. He never said a word that any of these acquaintances that he had met from these visits, he never said squat to any of them that they were going to be written into the storyline of this book about the area. So you can imagine how everything really exploded once Shepherd of the Hills did come out to the public and was released in 1907. So anyway, the railroad came through, and this little neighborhood of Garber, Missouri was doing very, very well. There was even a time where it actually picked up to where there was, in I would say, a 14 square mile area, and I'm counting some of the Stone County area on all of this too, friends. You definitely had nearly 100 families residing in this area. And you know, Reed Spring is only 6 miles west of Garber by railroad. So if you lived east of the tunnel up there on the railroad, you were classified basically as a Garber resident. So Garber did serve both counties. Garber had been down on the creek there for quite a while, but in 1907, to utilize the opportunities with the railroad and whatnot, the decision was made to move Garber's town site up onto the railroad tracks on land that had belonged to Jim Vining. And Jim Vining would be the brother of C.A. Vining, that's Charles Augustus Vining, who would be remembered as Fiddlin' Jake in the Shepherd of the Hills novel. So yeah, Fiddlin' Jake's brother Jim had the property that would become the Garber town site area. And this was actually where everyone was kind of working hand in hand together. The railroad came forward and said, "Hey, we'll help get Garber on the map." So in late 1906, they're all drawing up these plans and deciding, okay, we're gonna plot a town. Well, they had some good land to work with, roughly 10 acres, and everything got put in place. The plot and everything was filed over here at Forsyth in April 1907. At the same time, their postmaster had completely resigned, walked out. He's moved to Tulsa. And so J.K. Ross becomes the new Garber postmaster, their 4th postmaster, matter of fact. And so here we go now. The railroad is so behind in all their work, they can't keep up at all. And so things came just at a trickle pace. Garber didn't get a train depot until 1909. Later a blacksmith shop came, later a hardware store came. Well, they had always had a school, and there had been some little one-room schools in that community dating back into the late 1890s. If you guys know where Sycamore Log Church is located, keep on going down the road past the Sycamore Log Church, go, you know, under the railroad trestle, and right there along the railroad embankment, before you get to the parking lot for the north side of the Henning property, you're just going to be a little ways from the creek, not even a quarter of a mile. That little spot, which was owned by the Cox family, there was a spot up there that actually had a one-room school on it, and it was called the Roark School. Well, when the railroad construction was announced in 1901, they ended up completely closing it down. Actually, the building had burned before railroad construction commenced. But anyway, they ended up having school in 2 local homes and split Garber's school district in half. And so by 1904, they moved the Garber School up on the hill above the railroad on this land that would later end up in the possession of my great-grandfather. So anyhow, that kind of rolled that direction. Garber had a very successful school situation leading up even through the decade of the 1930s, and then it was all kind of shut down somewhere around 1940-ish. I don't have that exact date, but Branson swallowed it all up as far as the school district is concerned at that point. But here's where it gets really crazy for Mr. Ross, 1907. He's now Garber's postmaster. Charles is still in the picture. Charles is helping his father in running a grocery store business, and the two of them build this really nice frame building just yards from the railroad tracks. It's going to be the post office on one side and this Garber grocery store on the other, and things were working out very nicely. It was like, wow, we can get to Springfield in a very short amount of time. This 5-day monkey business of a trip to Springfield is done. So everyone was so excited over all that. It really brought progress quite quickly. But it didn't stop there. The railroad wanted Mr. Ross to be their station agent. Now keep in mind, they're still living at this home 2.5 miles away. He is saddling up every morning and riding cross country down that mountainside, crossing the creek and going up there to the county line where Garber is situated at the railroad. And so the man is never home. He can't focus on his farm. Let me also back up and state that there was a period of time right after they had gotten this home built that he and his boy took over possession of a sawmill operation down on Fall Creek on the upper end of Mutton Hollow. And the man was getting calls all the time because everyone was so admiring the qualities of this house. Mr. Ross, can you come help us build a barn? And then other communities, churches, other buildings, all came to be one-room schools and all this board lumber taken care of at that sawmill property. Friends, I actually have a piece of board lumber in my hand that was done at that sawmill down there on Fall Creek. Curtis, you've been to the site. You know where it's at. It's just inside on the Stone County site. Am I correct?
Yeah, it's right on the line.
Right on the line.
Right on the line.
Yeah. When you're standing there on the porch of the Ross cabin and you're looking down into the valley below, and just a little bit to the right of that was where it was. Straight shot down. Absolutely right. So Mr. Ross was, by the way, this is off Uncle Ike's house, Levi Morrell's home out there at Notch. But anyway, prime craftsman, and everyone was just bugging him all the time for building projects. Well, anyway, so life at Garber has just got him so consumed. Again, he's never home, and this goes by for several years. Now, I'm going to back up and state that the popularity of the Shepherd of the Hills novel did not hit this area just boom immediately. It took a little bit of time, and once it was out there, the fans are all wanting to flock in and see what this is all about. So you're actually starting to see some major visitor traffic from 1909 going forward. And it just continues onward, and by the time 1910 rolls around, Mr. Ross is completely worn out day after day with this 2.5 mile commute from the house to Garber and back. So the decision is made that we're going to sell. Let me back up and say that by 1908, their son Charles is now completely out of the picture. He marries a young lady by the name of Ellen Faulkner, and they relocate to Pomona, California. They were married in February of 1908 there. So our wonderful young Matt character in the Shepherd of the Hills story does not capitalize off of any of the fame. He is a permanent California resident. He had gotten real interested in photography before they came to this property in 1895, and actually ran his own photo business with the help of his new friend George Hall, and they had a short run doing it together, but then by the time Charles wound up on the West Coast, Mr. Hall continued this photo business, and that's where we see all these many hundreds of wonderful Hall photo postcards. But anyway, as they're moving forward now, Garber gets news that, oh, we're gonna bring you a retired boxcar for a train depot. So that hits them, and 1910 goes, and you're now seeing again the more trickle of visitors. But all of that is what led Mr. Ross and Mrs. Ross to sell this 160 acres. And I'm not sure just exactly how they made their point in letting the world know that the farm was even for sale, because lo and behold, the fellow that ended up buying the place was not even from here. He was from Topeka, Kansas. The new owner was none other than William Driver. He was head football coach and phys ed director at Washburn University. And by the way, I'm very grateful to team of historians at Washburn University because I brought this to their attention 2 years ago, and I said, I'm looking for a William Driver. He was your phys ed director. Oh yeah, we know him. We've got his yearbook photos. So they sent me emails of this photography, and here's the funny thing. None of them out there had ever even heard that the man owned land in Taney County. Well, he meets the Rosses at Garber and gets off the train, and he's got a $50 cash down payment. Mr. Ross and he talked this over, and they've agreed on the final price tag for this 160 acres of being $789. Of course, interest is going to be thrown in on that, and that's going to bring it to an even $800. I have a copy of the deed, and before I leave today, if you want to see this deed, it's in my folder here, and I'll let you take a look at it, because you can faintly look down the side of the deed and see Mr. Driver's handwriting of what his monthly payment arrangements were to the Rosses to pay that thing off. And good Lord, the guy's either been holding money or he's got a darn good coaching salary going on out there at Topeka, because this man paid off the Ross farm by the end of 1911. Now, of course, this means that they're going to pack everything up out of that cabin and move to their new little house at Garber. Friends, there's the home. That's where the Rosses would spend the rest of their lives. It was nothing really fancy at all. And by the way, because of Mr. Ross's commitments, he couldn't even build the house. He hired a construction worker out of Reed Spring by the name of Hugh Rutledge to come over and do all this for him. And Rutledge was good. Rutledge was a good carpenter. He had actually built Garber's hardware store and helped with some other things right there close by. But anyway, they were happy with the new home. And that's, by the way, that is the house that Mrs. Ross would pass away in March 14th of 1923. So now that they are permanently settled in Garber, it's still the day-to-day workload, and all this time has passed, and J.K. is also responsible for being the county newspaper correspondent. And this was a position he'd actually taken while they were still living at the cabin. And in 1901, he got notification that the Taney County Republican paper was needing help and needing a columnist that could do the weekly Garber News. So this was actually a pretty good opportunity for J.K. as he ends up taking it. And I want to share with you this very first column that he wrote. I've got it right here. This is dated June 13th of 1901. It was written on June 7th, 1901. And this is so hilarious because in these early newspaper columns, it appears that Mr. Ross is writing it as if he's writing a letter to the editor. But yet he's telling basically the weekly happenings. So let's go back in time. June 7th, 1901. And there's no title on the headline of this column in the paper. It just says Garber, and it has a period after it. That's all it has. It will later be called the Garber Gleanings, was the name of the column. But here's what he says. He says, "Good morning, Mr. Editor. Have I any news? Well, let us think for a moment. W.R. Cox has taken a load of hogs to Springfield this week and will bring them back with his wife, who has been in Springfield several days receiving treatment for her eyes. We learned from last accounts that she was much improved, and we hope to see her return permanently cured. Mrs. Shearer and daughter Miss Grace are in Lawrence County helping to harvest the strawberry crop and will not return till the last of the month. D.W. Vandison and Silas Isaacs and a couple of others started to Kansas to the harvest fields, and Mr. Ed Pierce and George Garber will leave next week for Russell County, Kansas to help in the big harvest. Our own wheat will due to harvest next week. Is it dry here? Well, I should think some are having to prime their springs now to get a bucket of water, though we had a nice shower yesterday morning that helped some, but we need a rain such as the old darky prayed for, not a sizzly sangly one, but a regular gully washer. Although it is very dry, wheat is doing quite well, and corn, though far behind for the time of year, is doing well. Potatoes will be small and few on the hill. Pasture is drying up on the timberless hills, but the timber seems quite fresh. Stock water is getting scarce, and we hope for the better. We had preaching at Jake Fronebarger's house last Sunday with Reverend J.K. Ross at the book. On account of the burning of our schoolhouse on the night of May 1st, our Sunday school came to a standstill, but at the meeting last Sunday, it was proposed to build an arbor for the summer. In response to this, quite a number of men and boys gathered on Monday afternoon and built a nice arbor with an abundance of good shade, and yesterday returned and provided seats and a stand for the preacher. So now we will have Sabbath school every Sunday morning at 10 o'clock and preaching every first and second Sunday by J.K. Ross. We also have a good Sunday school at Captain Truman S. Powell's house every Sunday afternoon and preaching every second and fourth Sunday there by the same person. Our people are also talking up a 4th of July picnic, a real old-fashioned one with pies, cakes, lemonade, speeches, recitations, songs, and other trimmings to match. But no dance platform will be allowed. This gets good. It's high time that our people would dispense with the ancient rites of barbarism and Indian corn dances and red liquor feasts and hot gun and butcher knife accompaniments and take up the more elevating and educating methods of civilization and perpetuating the memories of our forefathers and securing to us a day that we will all reach up and pluck a feather from the old eagle's tail in a way that will not be humiliating to his venerable birdship. But then, Mr. Editor, I'm getting patriotic and will quit. If you can read this, I will write you again concerning our mineral prospects, providing the drought don't burn it up. Sincerely yours, Jack, June 7th, 1901. Wow. And it is so entertaining because literally all of these columns are set up that way. And I mean, he's being very, very truthful. You know, I've read through other community newspaper columns where they're just writing baloney. And J.K. Ross really nails it on the head a lot with his writings. And friends, this writing situation that he was a part of, it was long term. He was still doing it just into the weeks before he passed away in July of 1923. Now, there's going to be a little absence of newspaper business from him in this time frame of, I would say, December 1906 going forward up until about June of 1907, where they're getting the Garber Town site moved up to its new spot there on the railroad that I talked about. But other than that, he's very fluent and makes sure that a weekly column is going to be present in the Taney County Republican. Not only are their readers thrilled with him, but some of the competing newspapers, such as here, the Branson Echo, grabbed him up also to take on a column project in 1906. That lasted for 3 years. Then we ended up getting 2 more Branson newspapers. In 1913, we had the White River Leader. How many of you remember reading the White River Leader? Look at the hands flying up. Isn't that great? That was such a great paper, yes. And then there was the Branson Centennial that came out in 1913 and 1914. So here he is, he's writing for multiple papers all in the same time frame, and I've went through every one of them, kids, and I gotta tell you, the man will write something different every time. You will very seldom see the same things covered, and he had that much to write about, even though he was writing for, there at one point, 3 different papers at the same time. So you really got a bucket load of facts and figures, and I want to shout out and give a big thank you to the staff over here at the College of the Ozarks Library, because they've got all of that buried on microfilm in the library basement, and it took me, 12 or 13 years in my spare time just digging all those out, making hard prints for myself so that I could kind of just soak it all in and analyze it. And fortunately, Grandpa Willard was still alive when I was digging into all those, so he and I read quite a few of them together. And even though this was way before he was born, it was things that his dad had lived through, and the time when Calvin Jones lost 2 mules, and they were actually stolen and wound up in Seymour. So it's just little things like that that are just absolute family treasures. And so, yeah, I remember Daddy talking about that. You know, it was always what Grandpa Willard would reveal to me. So anyway, by 1913, Mr. Ross takes it upon himself, because the train is stopping every day at Garber, and all these visitors are getting off. The railroad is having a heyday with this, because the railroad, get this, they're going to announce on every morning run on their way to Arkansas. Here they are, they've just popped out of the Reed Spring Tunnel, and an announcement is made, hey, we're going to stop the train in 6 miles and let y'all off to meet your favorite book characters out of your favorite novel. Boy, everyone was just hoorah over this. Wow, we're going to meet old Matt and Aunt Mollie? They're here? So yeah, they stopped the train at Garber every morning, and so here's old Matt and some of the Garber town folk out, and they would actually greet the train every morning when it stopped. This was train number 209, and this stop was always the cause of them being late to Branson 45 minutes every morning. And then some. The poor rail system, bless their hearts, they were never on time because of this additional unexpected stop. But so many folks would get off and they would gladly pose for photos and again answer all the questions. And then by 1913 he's done this little paperback booklet that I shared with you. Things continue to move forward. Reading through the newspaper columns, it's really interesting to read Mr. Ross's take on the situation regarding World War I, and to see so many of the Garber boys leave out on the train and enter the service, and praying and hoping for their safe return. Then you start reading through the newspaper columns. There's little minor health issues, especially with Mrs. Ross. It seemed like from about 1917 going forward, every winter she would have a little bout with pneumonia, and it would just knock her down. And she was weakened considerably through those little ailments. And time went on. J.K. Ross would still, for publicity purpose, he would still hire occasional local photographers to come and take his photo. By the way, that's probably one of the best photos of Garber's train depot you are ever going to see. It's an actual Missouri Pacific boxcar that's got everything gutted out from under it. It's just sitting there on the ground. That particular unit was later removed, and during the decade of the 1930s going forward, they had just a little simple pavilion that you stood under to wait for the train. And if I took you up there now, you can actually see the 4 corner posts of that pavilion are still in the ground, just right off the edge of the tracks. Basically stood exactly where that depot was. This is just a common occurrence where fans have gotten off the train to meet him. But anyway, time goes forward, and there's still photographers coming to photograph he and Mrs. Ross for publicity purposes. And this one right here, to my knowledge, is the last one that they did together. This would be from around 1918, and you can definitely see how aged they are, as Aunt Mollie is going to be 72 years young in that particular photo. And then he writes in his newspaper columns going into the end of 1922 about how sick both of them are. Both of them have pneumonia at the same time, and neither of them could kick it. And then so at the beginning of March there, Aunt Mollie was not well at all. Mrs. Fronebarger had come over and helped, and also their neighbor Margie Walden was helping in the care of Mrs. Ross. So it was a difficult time, and then she passed there at home. Ended up that their son, of course, comes back from California for her memorial service, and then has to turn around and come back that summer. He actually came back right before his dad passed. Charles was going to try and get his dad to have enough improved health to just go to California permanently. That was the wish, but none of that ever materialized. And then a niece living up here in Springfield came and picked him up, and he actually died at the home of his niece July 14th. Of 1923, but absolutely the sweetest people in the world. You hear those statements that they couldn't stand the visitors. I think that is as far from the truth as anything. They graciously agreed to pose for all these hundreds of photos, and were amazingly hospitable. So those that have went in there and made little statements like that they were upset with all the visitor business, no, I don't think that was by far the case at all. And he talks in his weekly newspaper columns about how happy he was to see families from all states. And in his columns, as time went by, he would try to name various families and where they were from, and try to keep track of all of that. These little picture postcards from their final years are quite common. They were even reissued In the 1930s and 1940s, Uncle Ike's son, Levi Morrill's son, Oscar, had actually came out with a brand new commemorative Shepherd of the Hills picture postcard series in 1940. You can find those images all over eBay, and if you guys ever want to do just a simple search in finding some of these, you'll be blown away at how low the prices are on some of these later ones. But just type in the word Old Matt and Aunt Mollie in an eBay search and you'll be floored with what might show up. Now, it was quite hilarious back in February. Luana and I were about to go to bed one night, and I do this every night. I type in their names in eBay. It's one of the last things I do before I turn the light out at night. And lo and behold, that photo of their house at Garber showed up just after the first of this year. And I thought, oh my dear Lord, that's exactly the way Grandpa Willard described it. And so the seller obviously didn't know what they had. And I scrolled down, and sure enough, there it is, the buy it now option. And they were only asking $5. So I saved it. Sorry, Rick. Rick Gunner, my good buddy there, who is into collecting a lot of these picture postcards. He and I have had a lot of fun digging into them and collecting them over the years. Well, we're going to wind this down, boys and girls, friends and neighbors. It's been fun to give you guys just a little bit of an inkling. Come out and join me on the tour at the Shepherd of the Hills, and I'll walk you through the house. Everyone says, you know, in regards to Old Matt's cabin, what is perhaps the oldest items in this house? Because yes, it still has much of Mr. and Mrs. Ross's personal things in it. I would say it's very safe to say there's probably 2 items. When you walk in the living room with me, I will show you what was referred to as Old Matt's Kentucky rifle. That firearm is hanging on the wall directly above the fireplace, and I did some digging and discovered that that particular firearm belonged to his dad, and that was the gun his dad used when he was in the Civil War. So it's been there all that time. The other item that probably ranks it being one of the oldest is when you walk into Aunt Mollie's kitchen with me, and we've got all this stuff displayed on their little wood cook stove. There is actually the framing and a cast iron mold for donuts. Mm-hmm. And I actually pick that thing up. I pick it up all the time when I got kids on the tour and let them actually hold on to it just to feel the weight of it and whatnot. But that has also been designated as one of the older items that is still there. But it's so great to get to help in all that preservation. We've got a question right back here.
When
yes.
do you give the tour?
So I do them right now Tuesday through Saturday, 10, 12, and 2 are the time slots. And if you happen to be out there on a day when they're doing the Shepherd of the Hills drama, which by the way are Tuesdays, Thursdays, and Saturdays, we do an exclusive 4 o'clock tour now. And that one's slightly different. We cover all the same stuff, but we spend a little bit more time on the outdoor theater side of the spectrum, because that's when they're getting all the livestock, getting all the horses ready, and I actually take everyone backstage anyway. We come right up to the cast dressing rooms, and there's a handful of my dad's cousins and some of the crew all helping in getting all the horses assembled and saddled, so we get to see all that. But yes, I'll be doing the tours all the way up through, let's see, I go back with the Sons of the Pioneers in early October, so you can catch me up to probably about the end of September. You guys want to come out and join me. And it takes about 90 minutes, although I have stretched it to beyond 2 hours. So, sorry, Jeff. Yes, sir.
What happened to JK's first wife? Did I know?
So we just know that it was an illness that caused her passing. She passed when Charles was barely a year old. Sorry, I ran past that. Yeah, I don't know the cause. I just know that she was 22 years and 13 days in age. But yeah, he would have been, Charles was basically 11 months old when his birth mother died, Mary Howe. Yeah, and I didn't think I was ever going to find anything on her, and I finally decided to reread that little paperback booklet again, and when he talked about Coffee County, Kansas, I thought, let's check with their county historical society and see if there's any marriage records, and sure enough, found J.K. Ross marrying this Mary Howe in 1872. So, yeah, it's fun. Any other questions? Yes, Harlan?
You said Howe, is that H-O-W-E?
It's spelled both ways. It's the funniest thing because when you look on the Find a Grave website, they've got it spelled both ways.
You know, there's Howes down in Missy.
It's a very common name in the Taney County
I don't know,
neighborhood.
I don't know.
Yeah. I've not dug into the research if there's any connection to those families, but it's absolutely the same spelling. Yes, ma'am, you took the tour with me on Saturday.
Yeah.
Yes.
I just want everybody to know that I took the tour with him last Saturday, and he is awesome.
Don't make me cry.
I thoroughly enjoyed
Well,
it.
thank you. It's a lot of fun, and I'm barely scraping the top of the pie pan. I kid you not.
I
You can,
got the old lady price, it was only like $17, so.
An old lady price?
yes, ma'am. You had a
Oh,
question?
yes, I was interested when you said it took 9 years to get the deed.
Mhm.
How were they protected? How was their ownership protected and all that?
The way I've read into it, in that homestead claim, you had to promise them that you were going to build the house.
True.
And if you did not, of course, then you were in big trouble and you lost out. That happened with multiple
Sure.
folks out there who thought, oh, this is going to be great, and then financially they just couldn't find a means to make it work, so the property would go back on the market, or in some circumstances, a homesteader could actually turn around and sell if they timed it right. But I don't know a lot of
They
details on
were
that.
on record and stuff.
They were on record because they had filled out the claim and turned it into the office there at Springfield, and they had started on that house. And again, they should have received that, you know, that in 1894, they should have had it within 5 years. And I've looked at some of my other relatives who were living there just north of them on the creek. They had filed in a time frame of the late 1880s and didn't see dates until way later. Thank you, Curtis, for uncovering all those dates. By the way, Curtis Copeland has been a big hand in all this research. He's actually uncovered a whole 10 square mile area of Garber neighborhood for me, and was able to find all those homestead dates family by family. Yes, sir.
This is a little bit off, but earlier I seen a picture up there that I think is a Garber schoolhouse.
Yep, I had one in there, yes.
Because I helped when we went out and was
Yeah.
restoring that.
So that was built by Mr. Ross and his boy Charles, and they started construction on that in the summer of 1904. Had it complete by Halloween. They had a big open house ceremony and started it right away, utilizing church services there every Sunday. So that was how they were able to get out of that brush arbor setup that they had been using down on the creek, which was actually on Fronebarger's place. But they ended up getting classes underway. They found a young 17-year-old that lived over here on Bear Creek, Miss Pease, and that's P-E-A-S-E. She was their first teacher, and classes commenced in January of 1905, I believe, there at the Garber School. So, yes, ma'am.
Are they buried at the Evergreen?
At Evergreen, yes, yeah. And it took some time to get their memorial all finalized. You can thank Pearl Spurlock
Yes.
for getting everything going to financially have a monument for them. Harold Bell Wright contributed money, and it took some time to do, but there sometime after their passing is when that was all put in. And that's the funniest thing for me, because those of you that run around and play at findagrave.com, it was the funniest thing, because when I saw their profiles for the first time, they were not listed as J.K. Ross or Anna Ross or anything. They're listed as their Shepherd of the Hills book character names. So no wonder I couldn't find them. So that's when I filled out my own little Find a Grave account, and I went in and I started making corrections. And so yeah, so it's been fun getting to track all that down. Yes, Deb.
The railroad section that's over by Garber now, is that still active?
Oh yeah, yeah. Occasionally the Branson Scenic Railway will run the line to Galena and go that way, but not very often. But they still run multiple freights on almost a daily basis, usually in the nighttime hours. But yeah, still very active and still being well kept. Absolutely. Yes, ma'am.
Did Charles have children, and how far did the descendants?
So there's another rabbit hole to get stuck in, because I've went through Ancestry and there is nothing listed about he and his bride Ellen having kids together, although I've got a young man who comes to Shepherd and takes the tour with me at least every year that claims he's related to Charles Ross, through Charles's children, but I had no idea who they are, and this young man is even slightly sketchy on his information and cannot tell me exactly how he fits into the picture. So there's another project that I haven't had a chance to go down yet. So I can tell you that Charles passed away kind of young. He was 58 when he died. He had continued his photography business when they moved to that area of California. He continued that, went to work at a packing factory, and then died from injuries in a motorcycle accident in 1934, and he was just 58.
John, we thank you very much.
Thank you, Jim. Thank you all for having me.